As we enter back into this conversation around embracing exile, I have found that probably the section that has meant the most and probably has created the most conversation is the 6th chapter about raising resident aliens. In fact, in my own small group at home with couples about my same age, I find that week after week, we mostly focus on our children who are transitioning from late adolescence into adulthood, and we find ourselves praying for them constantly for probably the great challenge of being a people who have embraced exile and find themselves living in exiles. What does it mean to raise children there? As I've said, one of the nice things about embracing the theme of exile is being able to read the prophets in some fresh ways. Maybe in this chapter, the prophet that helps us most is Daniel. For so much of that book is about how Daniel and his friends like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego try to maintain that life of being Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar wanting them to be leaders within the community. And yet at the same time, what does it mean to be uniquely the people of God living there? The challenges, the fears, the sometimes even persecutions that come as they try to live as God's unique people. In this chapter, I share one of my favorite things out of this project. I call it we confusion. When my wife and I first got married, it took me a little while to figure out that when she would say things like, I think we need to take the trash out, or I think it's time we mowed the lawn, that she didn't mean we, she meant me. For I usually was the one that took the trash out, and I am the only one usually who mows the lawn. But I often practice the we confusion too. I would say, I think it's time we made dinner, and I think that's happened about 3 times in 26 years. But I think about we confusion being, how do we think about our identity? Who are we? And sometimes it's easy for us to confuse the we. In our culture, is the we, are we Americans first and then Christians second? Or are we Christians? For I would say that there's a big difference between being Christians who happen to live in America and being Americans who go to church every once in a while. And that question of who is the we, I think is really critical, especially as we try to form our young people, form our children to be God's unique people, people uniquely committed to the purposes and the ways of God in the world. And as the stories are convoluted in our world, as the values are convoluted, I think this becomes even more crucial. I've learned a lot, as I share in the chapter, I've learned a lot about this from watching some of my friends who come from immigrant cultures, trying to raise their children with the identity of their home culture while also trying to fit and to make it in this thing we call the American economy and American life, without losing their unique identity. I always would marvel living in Los Angeles, not just at some of the culture groups there, but marveling every time I would see the Orthodox Jewish community walking to synagogue together with their black hats and long beards and curls and prayer shawls and all dressed, walking on Sabbath, because you can't drive, walking on the Sabbath to synagogue. And every time we would see those communities, my kids and I would have the same conversation. That is so strange, first of all, but how do you keep that unique way of life alive? The reality for many of us who are Christians, especially evangelical Christians, we're called to uniqueness, but we don't have black hats and we don't have curls and beards and we don't have all of the trappings. And so what are the things that make our life unique? What are the practices that we do as a family? For I'm convinced that part of what's helping my children transition from adolescence into adulthood and faith is that as a family, there have been certain things that have just been true for us in terms of actions and values. And we've been one of those families that we've tried to spend our money in ways that reflect our discipleship to Christ. And in our family system, we've tried to not make that secret, but to have that be conversation. So our children understood why maybe we weren't taking that trip this year, because our values as a family were different. The ways that we invested our money in our lives were different. In our particular case, being disciples of Jesus have meant transitioning communities, moving from place of ministry to place of ministry. And each time we've done that, I haven't made that decision and pronounced it to our family, but we've prayed together as a family. I'll never forget when we moved from ministry in Dallas, Texas to Southern California to Pasadena. Our oldest son, Caleb, who doesn't like to move. In fact, one time when we moved, I picked him up. He was a first grader, and on the way home he said, "Dad, I've decided I don't want to go to heaven." And I said to him, "Caleb, other people have choices, you do not." And so for the next several stoplights, I preached him my best sermons on heaven. And finally he said, "Okay, Dad, I'll go to heaven. I just didn't want to have to move again." We knew when we were moving from Dallas to Southern California that was going to be really hard on him. And I remember we were praying together as a family, and Caleb looked up with tears rolling down his cheeks, and he said, "Mom and Dad, if God is calling us to go somewhere, we have to obey God." And I just remember how touched I was by that. I'm touched by it right now. To think about how are our lives, our values, the directions of us as a family, how are those determined by our relationship with God? And so I would love for you to think about this. And this is an important conversation, a complicated conversation. But would love for you to talk about the ways in which we can raise our young people to be unique resident aliens, to be people who are in the world but not of it. What do you need the church to be for your family in order for your kids to come to understand what it means to follow Jesus with all that they are? Maybe you can have conversation about what are some of the things that you've done as families that have helped you. If you're comfortable enough with each other, this may be one of those moments to confess some of the things that you wish you could do differently. You leave those in the hands of God, but ways that if you could go back, and some of you can speak from wisdom, that you might do something differently this time. But most of all, my guess is for many of you gathered around in this small group, this is an opportunity for you to pray for your kids, for your grandkids, for those young people that God has put in your extended family thanks to this thing called the body of Christ. And spend some time really not only thinking and having conversation about how to do this well, but really spending time praying together that God would help you to be instruments of peace, instruments of grace, instruments of direction in the lives of the young people that God has given to us. It is so important for us to pass the baton of faith on from generation to generation. This may be one of the most challenging transitions that the church has faced in a long, long time. It's comforting to me to know that generational transitions are not new and challenges are not new in the history of the body of Christ, but this is a unique time. And so take this time to pray and invite God to help us to discover how to raise resident aliens.